Welcome back to Rockford Reading Daily. We are continuing to read The End of Policing by Alex Vitale. We are on Chapter 9, which is entitled Border Policing. Until the late 19th century, the U.S. had no formal immigration restrictions. The border was essentially open, with only customs controls directed at shipping. In 1882, after 200,000 Chinese laborers immigrated to build the railroads and perform farm labor in the West, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act to prohibit their further immigration. Much of the language used in debating the act was explicitly racist and consistent with local bans on the right of Chinese people to own property and appear as witnesses in court. Proponents referred to Chinese immigration as a, quote, Mongolian horde, end quote, and, quote, Johnny Chinaman, end quote, and accused them of being immoral and lazy. Small informal units were mobilized to limit unauthorized entry of Chinese immigrants, mostly among California's border with Mexico. The only restrictions on white immigration during this period banned those who were criminals, infirm, or politically radical. Anarchists were specifically banned in 1903, with Italians targeted for particular scrutiny. With the rise of mass immigration in the late 19th and early 20th centuries came growing nativist resentment. Throughout this period, groups such as the Immigration Restriction League and the American Party organized around ideas of racial purity, cultural superiority, and religious prejudice to demand an end to open immigration. This was finally achieved in 1924 with the passage of the National Origins Act, which established nationality-based immigration quotas for the first time. To enforce these quotas, Congress created the U.S. Border Patrol. The new Border Patrol focused on limiting unauthorized immigration from Mexico. Most enforcement was at designated border crossings, with only a few, quote, linemen, end quote, patrolling in between. In practice, individuals and even vehicles needed only to venture a few miles from a formal checkpoint to cross. During Prohibition, illegal cross-border trucking was a major concern for California farmers, whose fields and fences were often damaged, but they received only minimal help from the Border Patrol. Part of the reason for weak enforcement was the strong desire for Mexican workers among growers in Texas and California, who vehemently opposed restrictions on their access to cheap labor. The enforcement that did occur was often profoundly racist, with overt brutality and extrajudicial killings. Historian Kelly Hernandez describes revenge killings and reckless shootings of border crossers. During World War II, there was a great need for farm workers. The Border Patrol largely ignored Mexican immigration while keeping an eye out for possible enemy combatants, though almost none were discovered. The U.S. government developed the Bracero program to try and regularize migrant farm work. Employers were obligated to provide decent wages and working conditions, and migrants received official permits to work in the United States. Enforcement was lax, and wages and working conditions were quite poor and well below the standards set for other workers. Women, children, and domestic workers were not covered by the program, so unauthorized immigration continued. What up? What's up? In addition, many employers refused to use the new program, especially in Texas. Farmers and ranchers resented federal intervention in their long-standing labor systems, which often amounted to peonage. Workers who complained or organized against low wages and abysmal conditions were simply handed over to the Border Patrol for deportation. Throughout the early 1950s, the number of people apprehended by the Border Patrol doubled. In 1954, it launched Operation, and then the name of this operation is a slur for Mexicans, Mexican Americans, Mexican immigrants. Starts with a W. I'm not gonna repeat it. So in 1954, they launched Operation Slur, end quote, to try to stem the tide through intensive border enforcement and raids in cities and on ranches, forcing more employers to utilize the Bracero program. More than 1 million people were deported. In the end, the farmers and ranchers relented, especially after workplace protections were reduced and heavy penalties for worker organizing enacted. The title of the operation, however, speaks volumes about the mindset of federal officials and the Border Patrol. U.S. border enforcement has been primarily about the production of whiteness and economic inequality. The border has never been truly closed to poor immigrants. They have been allowed in with tight regulation or officially denied entry, but in practice allowed to enter in large numbers, with few legal protections from employer exploitation and abuse. Each of these systems places immigrants in a degraded economic position where their rights to organize are denied and they are forced to work in substandard conditions for low wages. One of the fastest expanding areas of policing in the past 20 years is border policing. Today, the Border Patrol is part of the Department of Homeland Security. In 1992, there were just over 4,000 Border Patrol agents. Following the attacks of September 11, 2001, that number increased to 10,000. Today, it stands at more than 20,000, making it larger than the ATF, FBI, and DEA combined. The Border Patrol is aided by local and state police and a variety of federal agencies, including the National Guard, the U.S. military, and Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE. In fiscal year 2012, the federal government spent more than $18 billion on immigration enforcement, more than all other federal law enforcement spending combined. Under the Trump administration, these numbers are likely to increase dramatically with the hiring of more officers and the building of more walls. Okay, give me 1 second. I gotta get something to drink, y'all. 1 second. We're gonna reflect here in a minute. And it's Friday night, so it's a little bit loud out here, man. I'm sorry about that. We outside. Sorry about that, y'all. Okay. Let's see how much we got before we get to the changing of the theme. Oh my goodness, my fault. Okay, we're not going to get to a changing of a theme for a second. Okay, so I'm going to read a few more paragraphs and then we'll do a reflection. Border policing has always been highly racialized. Foreigners to be kept out or allowed in only under degraded circumstances are always defined as outside the American mainstream, and this is generally accomplished by appeals to race. Martha McChaka's Recovering History, Constructing Race, describes how racial hierarchies were first established in the border region by the Spanish elite and later by American settlers looking to justify their expropriation of native and Mexican lands. Even some long-standing Mexican Americans have attempted to achieve whiteness by encouraging the exclusion of new immigrants who undermine their attempts to equate themselves with Americanness. Though, by embracing a racialized system of exclusion, they reinforce a racial caste system that in turn defines and treats them as less than full citizens. From early on, the Border Patrol has engaged in racial profiling. They have argued that, quote, looking Mexican, end quote, is sufficient grounds for stopping, questioning, and demanding identification. In 1973, the Supreme Court codified these practices in U.S. versus Bergoni-Ponce, in which it upheld the right of the Border Patrol to use racial profiles as the sole basis for vehicle stops and forced identifications. This is based in part on the 1953 federal law that gives Border Patrol agents the right to suspend constitutional protections within 100 miles of the border and stop, search, and ascertain the immigration status of any person, whether or not they have any probable cause or even reasonable suspicion. The ACLU maintains that this is a violation of the Constitution. They also point out that Border Patrol abuses have been reported far away from the border as well. In 2008, U.S. Senator Patrick Leahy was stopped at least 125 miles from the border, ordered out of his vehicle, and forced to produce identification. When he asked under what authority the agent was operating, the agent pointed his weapon at the senator and said, quote, "That's all the authority that I need," end quote. Okay, so let's reflect upon the passages that we just read there in border policing. And so I think once again, I think one of the commonalities between this chapter and this passage and things we've read in other chapters is what stands out. And again, this form of policing is highly racialized, the same way that we read about how the school resource officers were disproportionately arresting black children and children of color, the same way we read about how the war on drugs disproportionately affected black people and people of color and how that was racial, that form of policing was racialized. The same way we heard about how gang suppression was something that disproportionately affected black people and people of color. And each one of these different forms of policing has had an element of racism connected to it. And so this one falls right in line with that as well. Then there also has been a form of exploitation that has been connected to a lot of these different forms of policing, in the sense of capitalistic ambitions have crept into the form of policing to corrupt it. And so with border policing, we see that one of the ways that this system is flawed is because there are still people allowed through on such a regular basis, and they're allowed through because part of the economic system here is to pay people unequitable and unequal and not livable wages. And it's easier to pay non-livable wages and to have bad working conditions for people who do not have American citizenship or who who do not have who are here illegally. I don't want to use the word illegally not the proper term to use, but people who are not American citizens. And so since they can pay them less, there's a whole set of people who that's how they make more money. That's how they earn more money. That's a culture in some sense of a word. I don't know if maybe culture is the right word, but yeah, there is a culture of paying people who are not American citizens under the table and paying them less than they should be getting paid and having them working in conditions that they shouldn't have. And then, as was pointed out here, if they ever try to organize or unionize, they have the threat of being able to just have them deported out of the country. And so one of the other things I think one of the other things that stands out about this as well is the different groups. Each one of these chapters we've read, when we read about the war on drugs, it talked about how opium was connected to the Chinese community and the racism and stereotypes with Chinese people, how marijuana was connected with black people and Latinos, how heroin had been connected with, not heroin, but cocaine had been connected with black people. And so we see here again that this border policing has a connection with, in the inception of it, with Mexicans and with Native Americans. So let me see. And so we've seen an increase in an increase in the politicization of border policing in 1882 when there was a wave of Chinese laborers that came in. And again, I think what's important to point out is how labor disputes and labor fights are again at the center of a form of policing. In this country, race, just as far back as struggles around racism and fights and clashes around racism go back. So do fights around labor and equitable labor, and some in an not an argument, but in factual, and there's a way to articulate how even the original race fight, the original race war, the original race battles were inherently connected to wage battles and work conditions, because black people were relegated to being permanent workers, to being property, to only being labor. And so those are all things that I think are important to point out. Let's see. And then the name of the operation, even the name of this operation that the government launched in 1954, that was a slur. That lets you know the way that they view the people that they were interacting with, these human beings that they were interacting with. And I think that that's important, because we see time and time again as we read through these chapters the dehumanization that these police officers are inflicting on people, specifically people of color. All right, let's keep reading. Trying to find where we stopped at. All right. 1 second, y'all. My fault. The current intensification of border enforcement began in the early 1990s under the Clinton administration, with the launching of Operation Gatekeeper in California, Operation Hold the Line in Texas, and Operation Safeguard in Arizona, and the passage of the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigration Responsibility Act of 1996, IRIRA, or IIRIRA. Within a few years, funding for what was then the Immigration and Neutralization Service, INS, doubled, as did the number of Border Patrol officers. These operations represented the first real effort to close the southern border. It involved several new initiatives, including significantly increasing the amount of fencing, immediately deporting immigrants living in the U.S. for a long list of major and minor criminal infractions, creating immigration courts in border areas to facilitate quicker processing and deportation of captured migrants, and creating a massive system for identifying migrants through biometric data collection. The latter two initiatives became the basis for ramping up criminal prosecutions of migrants for crossing the border without authorization. Excuse me. Sorry, I was a little rough on that last paragraph. This process intensified after 9/11. Even though President George W. Bush had campaigned on the platform of more open borders, he oversaw additional fencing, increased Border Patrol hiring, and the intensification of the criminalization of migrants. As a result, the police shifted from what was euphemistically called, quote, catch and release, end quote, to one of, quote, capture and hold, end quote. For decades, most migrants caught crossing the border were asked to waive their right to a hearing to challenge their deportation and then quickly return to Mexico, spending as little time in custody as possible, which was generally advantageous for both the migrant and the U.S. government. Now, an ever-growing number of migrants are being prosecuted. A first offense of illegal crossing is punishable as a misdemeanor. A second offense of illegal re-entry, however, is now a felony that could result in years of incarceration. In addition, immigrants convicted of other crimes are now being sentenced and incarcerated for their full terms in a U.S. prison before being deported. In 2005, with massive new funding and infrastructure, the Border Patrol began to implement a series of zero-tolerance, quote, capture and hold, end quote, policies under, quote, Operation Streamline, end quote. Over the ensuing 10 years, more than 400,000 migrants were prosecuted for improper entry and over 300,000 for the felony of re-entry. The Trump administration had pledged to expand this practice. The U.S. government has spent $7 billion on this approach, with much of the money going to private for-profit prisons. Despite the prosecution and incarceration of 750,000 people at the border, they found no deterrent effect on migrants, who are driven by profound and desperate poverty and the desire to unify families. They also interviewed judges and lawyers and found widespread opposition, with most characterizing it as a politically driven policy lacking any legitimate policy achievements. Sorry about that. In addition, Operation Streamline has corrupted the federal court system. Judges and court personnel near the border cannot keep up with the massive volume of defendants, which has reduced their ability to properly handle these cases or adjudicate other matters. Texas Monthly Magazine found that the two busiest federal court districts in the country are in Texas, and that the courts are dealing with the load through mass prosecutions. Dozens of defendants are routinely ushered into court together, often without any real legal representation, are asked to plead guilty, and are then either deported or incarcerated. In 2009, the Ninth Circuit of Appeals stepped in and demanded that defendants at least be asked individually about their pleas and their ability to understand what was happening. But that ruling merely slowed down the process without changing its basic character. Even though apprehensions along the border have been declining for decades, nearly 40% of all federal prosecutions are now related to immigration. Even prosecutors who remain committed to a punitive framework see that this system fails to deter migrants. One noted, quote, "We prosecute people because they have committed violations of statutes enacted by Congress that reflect what our norms are. We mete out punishment according to some systematic process. If some people are deterred by it, good. If not, I'm not surprised." End quote. This statement lays bare this bind in which the entire institution finds itself. Police, prosecutors, and judges all see the futility of criminalizing a population driven by extreme hardship to seek out a better life across the border. Today, there are 75,000 non-citizens in U.S. prisons, about half of whom are there for immigration violations. Many are held in for-profit private prisons. ICE uses 46 such facilities to hold 70% of all immigration detainees, despite repeated reports of abuse, overcrowding, and inadequate medical services. In addition, ICE subcontracting opportunities have encouraged a boom in jail and prison construction across the Southwest. Both local jurisdictions and these corporations have a financial stake in maintaining high rates of detention, further perverting the politics of immigration. In addition, large number of migrants are held in local jails on immigration detainers or awaiting transport. Conditions in these facilities, whether public or private, are inadequate. In 2010, the New York Times documented widespread problems with the delivery of healthcare services. According to a 2016 report, 8 people have died in recent years of preventable causes such as diabetes because of inadequate healthcare. During the Great Migration of unaccompanied youth from Central America over the last few years, tens of thousands of children have been held in detention and many forced to appear in court without representation, creating a legal and humanitarian crisis. Thousands of families with small children have been held for extended periods in immigration detention while awaiting deportation or immigration court proceedings. These conditions are deplorable, especially for children. The U.S. courts have recognized the inappropriateness of this, especially given that these families pose almost no safety risk. Despite repeated court rulings, the federal government continues to hold families with children in custody. In addition, the U.S. has issued about $1 million detainer orders requesting local and state police to hold someone suspected of being in the country illegally. These detainers ask local police and sheriffs to be the front line of immigration enforcement. Beginning with the border buildup of the 1990s, local police were offered the opportunity of receiving the official authority to enforce federal immigration law. This authority, under Section 287G of the IIRIRA, has created a huge dilemma for local police, who have been pressured to participate, but in many cases view that cooperation as counterproductive to good policing. Most police believe that, to be effective, they need the cooperation of the community. It is community members who report crimes, provide information, and act as witnesses. In areas with high rates of unauthorized immigrants, fear of police is already very high. If people believe that they or their friends, family members, co-workers, or neighbors may be at risk of deportation, they will be gravely reluctant to bring any issues to the attention of police. Okay, I think we're going to finish this page up and then we're going to end this, do a reflection and end this episode. Okay, let me see. That is why many cities have either refused to participate in 287G or designated themselves, quote, sanctuary cities, end quote, that refuse to cooperate with immigration enforcement efforts. Unfortunately, these declarations are sometimes rather hollow. New York City has a sanctuary statute, and the NYPD does generally avoid involvement with immigration matters. However, for many years, corrections officials cooperated, even renting jail space to federal officials. More recently, they have moved those operations out of jails, so immigration officials merely station themselves in the courts and apprehend people after their court appearances. Under Obama, ICE tended to focus their effort toward those convicted of violent felonies. Under the Trump administration, any crime might trigger such proceedings, leading to widespread concerns that the hundreds of thousands of, quote, broken windows, end quote, arrests that occur each year for minor infractions, like jumping the subway turnstile, might put many more people at risk of deportation. In addition, 287G is part of a process of enhancing police power by blurring the lines between civil and criminal enforcement. Normally, police are required to ensure people's constitutional rights when they suspect them of a criminal violation. Since most immigration violations are technically civil, the same protections do not apply. This means that police, sometimes under the guise of immigration enforcement, can enter people's homes without a judicial warrant and hold people in custody without the opportunity to post bond. Pushback from many local jurisdictions led to a reduction in 287G agreements under the Obama administration, but the Trump administration has attempted to ramp up these agreements and bring sanctions against cities that refuse to participate or engage in other, quote, sanctuary city, end quote, practices designed to impede increased deportations. All right, and then we're going to end this episode here, and then we'll pick back up on the next episode in this spot. I think some of the things that stand out to me from this is the mass incarceration element stands out to me. Throughout this book, we've read primarily about what I would consider to be police terrorism. Small things of mass incarceration were mentioned, but throughout this chapter, we got a very specific painting of mass incarceration in the perspective of immigrants and in the perspective of people who are being held in immigration detention centers. I think that would be the proper terminology to describe them. And they spoke about the substandard conditions that they're in. They even did take a little bit of time out to speak about jails and county jails and the substandard living conditions that those are. That really the dehumanizing, that the substandard is not even a good enough way to, giving it too much justice. There is a dehumanizing, inhumane standard of living and form of living, the way that people are fed, the way that people are treated, the way that people are become numbers in a system, the amount of violence that exists inside these jails, inside uh, these these facilities, and it's all done purposefully, and it goes to further traumatize the people who have already been and victimize the people who have already been pushed to the margins of our society. And I think that that is one of the things that we have to be able to say in coordination with speaking about police terrorism. Each one of these chapters that we have went through and read, the end result for the people that are caught up in these forms of policing is going into one of these jails that have a local jail that has horrible living conditions. And then also here too, we've seen how this issue was politicized and how different parties use this issue to try to further their political careers, and we see how these laws get passed, and these laws are used to basically violate people's constitutional rights. We see how the police blur the lines between these laws and take advantage of people who are in these situations. And again, you just see how the people who are vulnerable in our society are constantly exploited, constantly oppressed, constantly devalued, dehumanized. And I think that that's what really stands out here as we read about another aspect of policing. And I'm trying to think, is there anything else here? And this is something, the border policing is something I need to do the work of becoming more educated and more informed on, and I am working to do that. Okay, so yeah, let's end this episode here. I want to thank people for taking out the time to listen to Rockford Reading Daily. We put these episodes out on a daily basis to present people the opportunity to begin and further their journey in the struggle to end police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. If you have not listened to previous episodes, please go back and listen to those. If by the time you hear this, there are future episodes out, please go and listen to those. Holla at you tomorrow.